all of our dog scales coming in. Um, thank you all for coming today. It's super exciting to be here for our very last session. Feel free to keep your dog scales going on, but I'll give you an update about how today's group is doing. And I would say we overwhelmingly are choosing the 5. So it's clear that you all are tired. It's been a long week. It's probably been a long year. So I'll try to keep this short and to the point, but I want to make sure you all get what you need. So feel free to use the chat box for any of those other questions. Interestingly, we did have a fair number of 3s on this call. So hopefully it gets a little bit less frustrating for you. All I can say is thank goodness tomorrow is going to be Friday, and then you'll have your weekend and it'll be amazing. We do have a lot of 9s, and I find it pretty interesting that some of you are sitting in of our 9s, and our 6s are sitting in some groups with some of our 3s, right? So maybe that's that interaction. We can get you all sort of teared up. So if you're interested in these types of things, I actually have one. It's a cat scale, not as sophisticated, but it really is sort of helping us get to where we are. We know it's been a long week. We're in the afternoon, so just bear with us and sit back. Luckily, we're in a webinar, so you can listen and chat and submit your questions anytime you'd like. So Dina is a little bit late and she got stuck on her plane. So I'm going to get us started and then she might come in. You will see Susan Shipley will be putting in some of the links to the resources, to our Q&A and to our evaluation in the chat box as well. You all are free to use the Q&A throughout today's session. If you have any questions, comments, and I'll be able to share those. I know folks are wanting to see the numbers for folks because we are in a webinar. I'm the only one that can see what people put in, but I will tell you that I had 15 5s and 8 9s, 9 6s, 11 2s. So that'll give you some of the more progress monitoring data that we have today. So thanks y'all for doing that. So just a couple of things. We are recording each of the sessions. So you did see that start and you'll be able to access the recording later. All of the questions, as I mentioned, will be entered into the Q&A box. You're not able to use the chat box. It will just be outgoing as opposed to ingoing. So just make sure you do use that Q&A if you have questions. You will get a certificate of attendance. This is the last session. And at the very end, there will be an evaluation, and we'd love your feedback. This is something different that we've done, you know, creating these resources to really break down what sometimes is a more complex concept so that you can implement those in your sites or help others within your site do that. The book study email did come out, so I think a lot of you signed up for that, so be on the lookout for information for that as well. You can see in the chat, there is the handout for today. It's a very similar structure to the other 2, but focuses primarily on today's topic, which is delivery adaptations. So the purpose of what we're doing here is really around understanding the 3 elements of adaptation for SDI. So we started with a content adaptation, we moved into methodology, and now we're in delivery. And even though we broke them apart, technically they all work together to create a single proposed service, right? But we break them down because it allows us to think more strategically about how we implement those and document that within the IEP. We've been sharing, or I've been sharing, some practical approaches. The handout really gets into what are some of the evidence-based practices for these adaptation areas, as well as some resources to help you with the implementation of that. And so you'll see a lot of resources through all of the 3 sessions. I'm actually going to review some of those from the previous 2 sessions that also will help you with today's session. So I do want to do a quick review, and obviously we're here to talk primarily about what is SDI, So I just want to make sure, Shiloh, you can see the handout in the chat box. If you can't see it, let us know and we'll repost that for you. But when we think about SDI, what we're looking at is specialized instruction that's being provided to an identified student with a disability. And what we've been doing is really breaking down the parts of what are considered to be SDI. And that's that adaptation to content, adaptation to methodology, or adaptation to delivery. And in your IEP, you might actually see a space for each of those. But if you really look at the state and federal regulations, at least one of those needs to be identified. And as we talked about in the first session, the content area is really the go-to because there's something about the disability that's impacting this child's access and progress in the general curriculum. And you can look at how they became eligible, what were some of the generalized impact of that disability category to help us get into what does this kid need to be taught. So I'm going to talk about that one first, and it's going to make a little bit of difference around delivery adaptations because some things require delivery adaptations. So for example, if I'm teaching toileting, I don't just do it one time a day. Most people have to go more than one time a day. So it does affect our delivery of that particular specialized instruction. Now, we talked about content adaptations in two different types of domains. One is the academic domain. And when we think about academics, it's generally related to the subjects that we see in school. But specially designed instruction is not about the delivery of standards. That's really what we do for general education to make sure kids have are able to progress on their state assessments and meet their graduation requirements. When we think about SDI, what we're trying to address are the academic deficits or needs that are preventing this child from fully benefiting and accessing the general curriculum, right? So you don't have SDI in history, but you might have SDI in basic academic skills or literacy skills or comprehension or writing that's going to help you benefit from the history general curriculum. Now, we also talked about functional skills. And if you look at that first handout, you probably see that every kid who's been identified under IDEA was identified because they also had some functional skill needs. And it's really critical that our SDI addresses those appropriately, right? If the kid has a attention deficit or maybe challenges with processing or language or communication that's impacting their literacy performance or math performance, we need to both address the functional skill and the academic skill so that the kid can fully benefit from our curriculum. Now, the question we start to ask here is, what does the child need to be taught, right? So that's where we're getting into, is it math, literacy, toileting, executive functioning skills, strategies, mobility, right? So we can break those down pretty simplistically. And if you think about the impact of the disability, so we talked about, for example, other health impairment. And if you read the definition, we know that every child who's been identified with an other health impairment had some of these needs manifesting in a way that impacted their performance. So then we look at, not just the disability, but how the disability impacts this individual child. And then we think about, based on that, what skills, knowledge, or strategies does this child need to be taught to be successful? Now, we also talked about methodology, and we did receive some questions afterwards, so I want to make sure that I get to those. And the methodology adaptations are how we're going to teach that particular content. Now, some content, does well with certain types of methodology, but really what we're looking at is um, not just like the delivery of it, but the instructional approach that I'm using so that the student can benefit from this content. And in the handout from our second session, we talked about a number of evidence-based methodologies that we commonly see as part of SDI design and delivery. Systematic explicit instruction is often our go-to, but there are other things that you'll commonly see, like multisensory language-based methodology, peer-mediated instruction. Now, these things that we would document in the IEP should be justified by your data, right? It's not what you're going to do so much as what does this child need in order to be able to benefit from special education and ultimately the general curriculum. Now, some important points, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these based on some questions, that there is no one methodology. And as a special ed teacher, you know your child best. And in the delivery of the instruction you're providing, you start to see that the kid responds to some approaches to instruction, but not to others. And our progress monitoring data becomes that evidence of what is working or not working for an individual student. If we don't really know the student that well, they just transferred or they were just identified, we often start with an explicit instruction methodology approach. However, if we don't have evidence that the kid needs it, we often don't document that yet in the IEP. We're really just implementing the other adaptations that have been identified. And then over time, our data will confirm or disconfirm whether one of those methodologies is better for this student than another one. It's also important to know that methodology needs change over time. So, and when kids are younger, we may be doing more naturalistic type approaches. But as kids get older and the discrepancies between where they are and where they need to be get farther, we tend to gravitate more to very discrete trials, explicit instruction, because we're looking for more errorless learning approaches. Methodology also varies based on what you're teaching. So, for example, Orton-Gillingham methodology or a multisensory approach works really well for academics. There's not really a lot of evidence about how it works for teaching functional skills. In some cases, we find that certain needs respond better to certain methodologies, and those are broken down in that handout too. But we can't make a one-to-one. All kids with autism benefit from methodology X. All kids with learning disabilities require a certain methodology. The evidence just does not support that. It might support the majority of students or a significant number of students, but your progress monitoring data determines, does it help this student? The other thing about methodology adaptations, and I'm going to talk about this on a second slide, is that we're really documenting adaptations that the child needs based on the existing evidence, not the methodology that you're going to use, right? So the IEP is documenting what this child needs in terms of service, and then you as an LEA, teacher, there's deference to you in how you're going to implement that, unless it tells me how to implement that. And with that said, it's important to remember that methodology is not the same as a program. So we would not document programs like a Wilson program or a Project Read or something within the IEP, because that's not an adaptation. What we're documenting are the features of that instruction that the child needs. We might choose to use Wilson to implement the SDI, but the SDI itself are the documented adaptations in that IEP. And I'll give an example here. I do want to say, so there is, we hope that you ask questions at any time. We'll use the Q&A feature to do really live questions, but maybe you have some more meaty questions or things that aren't really relevant to today's session, but you want answered. This is where you'll be able to put those, and then some additional supports will be coming out around those. Sheila, do you want to share something? I see your hands raised. I don't see you, but I don't. That might require Dina or Susan to let Sheila say something if she wants to say something. All right, we'll figure it out here in a second. Oh, did I get you? There you go. Sheila, do you want to share? All right, we'll come back to them. So today's session is really focused on the delivery of instruction. Now, when we think about delivery, we often confuse it with the last required item of an IEP, which is where you would document the duration, frequency, and projected start date of all services, right? So that's a bigger IEP like components, just saying how much service are you going to get. When we think about delivery adaptations, we're talking specifically in this case around how we're going to deliver the particular instruction. Is it going to be in a small group? Is it going to be in the afternoon? Does it need to be 5 days a week or 2 days a week? So that's what we're going to get into, is understanding the nuances there. I'm trying to manage them both, so. Okay, so this is where, just to help sort of clarify, based on some questions I also received, is when we think about SDI adaptations, this is the IEP team's responsibility to identify what is the special education that the student needs, right? So as a team, you identify, are there specific content that needs to be addressed by the special ed? Is there a specific methodology that the student requires, or an approach to delivery that we need to make sure, regardless of where this kid is in terms of the school they're at or who the teacher is, everybody's in agreement that this is the adaptation the child needs. Those are things that the IEP team, which includes families, are responsible for identifying. Once that IEP is done and the team determines that it's reasonably calculated to help the kid progress on IEP goals and address their unique needs, then the IEP goes to the district or the LEA, and they're responsible for implementing that service, right? And when we look at the courts and how that sort of pans out, there's deference to the LEA in how you end up implementing the SDI. The design and the adaptations, it's an IEP team decision, but how you actually implement those adaptations, there's a little bit of flexibility for you based on, how, you want to ensure maximum access to the general curriculum. So you have some flexibility in how you implement that. So I'm going to put an example up here and you can use the chat box. So we have a 4th grade student and they're identified with a specific learning disability that impacts basic reading. That's how they were identified, in the checklist. And their individual student data indicate that they need the following adaptations. One, the specially designed instruction is got to be around basic skills, specifically decoding and phonological awareness. We also know from the student data that this student needs a multisensory language-based approach to the delivery or to the methodology of that instruction. And our data also indicate that this kid benefits primarily from small group instruction. They get overwhelmed in the big classroom. The small group instruction works. And that because of the intensity of their needs, they have found from their data that 45 minutes of this instruction is necessary to promote progress. Now, what I want you to think about is if this kid came to your school, how would you design and implement the programming for this student? Okay, so you can share in the chat or really the Q&A and just think about what you already have in your school that would allow you or make it easier for you to be able to implement these particular adaptations. So I'll give you about 30 seconds. And Dina, I'm just trying to clean out the Q&A so I can make sure I see all the questions.
Yeah, and I can help you do that too if you'd like.
Yeah. Yeah, you could break it up into smaller 45-minute sessions throughout the day. It's a great suggestion. What else could you do? And I'm going to share on the next slide how 2 schools chose to do this same IEP, but I'm curious, like just your current context, what it might look like. Yeah, you have a win time. That would be a great time to be able to find those 45 minutes. It's already structured in a small group, so you kind of have the infrastructure for it. Excellent. Anybody else? Is there a particular intervention you all might use, or maybe a program you already have in your school? Yeah, so we see, yeah, so somebody said I might use Lexia. Alexia covers the content adaptations. It does have a basic multi-sensory approach, but the teacher could adapt it a little bit. And as long as it's delivered in small group for a minimum of 45 minutes throughout that day somehow, then you've met your obligation. A lot of people talk about Orton Gillingham. Yeah, using Foundations, Haggerty, which are also Orton Gillingham based programs, Wilson, right? So now you're thinking about what are the specially designed instruction adaptations, and then how are you going to implement those? So that's different than a delivery adaptation. Excellent. So on the right-hand side, you'll actually see 2 examples of how schools took the same specially designed instruction adaptations and designed and implemented that programming to address the needs of that student, right? Our obligation is first to identify what are the dimensions, right, of that SDI. That's what the IEP does. And then take that and implement it in a way that works for the student within the context in which they're functioning. So with School A, you will see that they took that same thing. They had an interventionist delivering it. There's nothing in the IEP that identifies a specific person needs to do it. So they used the most trained person to deliver that. They did use a Wilson reading system, and they already were using that within their Tier 2 intervention block. So similar to somebody talking about WIN, they're already using a structured block that prevents the student from missing Tier 1 and getting that supplemental instruction. And what they did is they just maintained that the group size would be 6 or less and that's what they were defining as a small group. Now, School B, the kid got up, transferred to another school. They took a different approach based on their resources, the context, but they still adhered to the adaptations identified in the IEP. So they have a reading specialist who's an expert in Orton Gillingham, who designs and delivers daily 45-minute multisensory SDI, and she has 3 other students with learning disabilities. The previous school had a mixture of kids with and without disabilities, and in this case, they structured it for kids who probably also had very similar needs. And the other thing that they did is they worked in the general education to ensure the general education teacher also used a multisensory approach. And that's going to come down to attention to transfer. So from a delivery adaptation, they kind of went above and beyond and ensured that they were also using some of that multisensory instruction within the general education classroom. so that the student could also access and benefit from the general curriculum. And a lot of you are probably already doing this, but when people say, well, why are you using that program? We need to be able to articulate the program addresses the content adaptation, the methodology adaptations, and delivery adaptations that are outlined in the child's IEP, right? And that really shows that we're picking something that's reasonably calculated to help the student make progress. Now, similar to our other sessions, we've talked about, well, how do I know about delivery adaptations? So just that last part, and honestly, they're pretty similar to how we identify, some of our content adaptations or our methodology adaptations. In your handout, you will see that there is actually a section that gets into this in a little more detail and provides some resources. Give me one second. I'm roasting myself. I know some of you said you were one with the blanket over. It's pretty warm in my house now. And so I just want to share, we think about this delivery adaptations. We do sometimes see this outlined in the evaluation report. It would be great if it was there, especially if the child participated in a tier 3 or a bit team process where the school tried a 30-minute block or a 45-minute block to give you a sense about, are there some elements of delivery that this child needs for full benefit? There are some things we can pull out from the disability category or the needs associated with the disability. And I'll just give an example for other health impairment. So if you think about that other health impairment, are there adaptations to the way we deliver, whether it's when we deliver it, how or who's delivering it? Is there a certain time of the day? We can look at the impact of the disability for that child and make some decisions. So my own son, my youngest, has an other health impairment, and he gets very fatigued in the afternoon. So as a result, a delivery adaptation for him is his specially designed instruction is only delivered in the morning prior to lunch, right? Because that's what the data indicates he needs in order to actually benefit from the instruction. So here's another example. And so I just want you to take a moment. So if you think about traumatic brain injury, it really affects people all sorts of different ways. But if you look at the types of impacts, memory, cognition, reasoning, sensory, feeling overwhelmed, then we start to say, gosh, are there some delivery adaptations or considerations that we would consider for a kid with a traumatic brain injury? And if you're not so sure, just think about memory. So I'll just narrow it down on most individuals who've had a traumatic brain injury have impacts on memory. How might that impact our delivery of the SDI for students? What might you do differently? I mean, a lot of you did tell me you were a 5 today, so, what would have sort of broken it out a little bit? Yeah, so we see lots more repetition. So it makes us think differently about the way we're going to deliver that instruction, shorter times, aligning across, the school day. We're not just going to be able to do a 30-minute block in the morning for that kid because they're probably going to forget it by the end of the day. But if we weave it in our classes, if it's distributed across the school day, then that might be a delivery adaptation that's addressing the unique needs of the disability. We had some smaller chunks, breaking it down, visual checklists that need to be there. Excellent. And some of that information, like from the onset, we may not really be sure. So what we would do is try it out. So going back to our child who has a traumatic brain injury, We had our initial SDI. We didn't really think about the delivery adaptation. We did all their SDI at the very beginning of the day. It just didn't work. So then we try variations of delivery. We did it, maybe we broke it down into 10 small chunks in the day, 3 small chunks in the day, right? And that's really how we use this iterative process with our progress monitoring data to confirm or disconfirm what types of delivery adaptations this child may need. And we want to identify those earlier than later, right? I mean, some kids are in special ed for 10 years or more, right? So we don't want to wait 10 years to figure that out. We want to engage in this process very early on to identify those specific adaptations so we can tweak the SDI over time to get to that optimal programming for the child. So I'm going to share some examples, of what this might look like. You'll see there's a handout in the chat box, so definitely grab that. Now, there is endless ways to think about delivery adaptations. And I always joke, there could be a delivery adaptation that says, oh my heck, the kid, the teacher needs to be dressed in a brightly colored clown suit to, improve engagement. Those things may work, but really what we're talking about is the more consistent or the ways in which we're going to actually put it into practice. Otherwise, the district can do whatever they want. But we know for some kids, it's got to be done this way, regardless if you're in school A or school B. So those things would be documented in the IEP. All right, so some considerations, and a couple of folks mentioned that in that last scenario, repetition. And that is actually a known finding for most kids who struggle. They need about 10 to 30 more practice opportunities than a typically developing kid. And that's why special education is a service that's offered. It's in addition to the general education curriculum to ensure that the child gets more instruction and more practice opportunities to be able to access and learn the same things as their peers without disabilities. There are some things that impact how much dosage or how much exposure a child might get. So grouping size is one. If I have a group size of 15, the kid's not going to get as many practice opportunities as a group size of 2. Right? So we have to take into account what is the optimal group sizing for this child to be able to benefit from the instruction that we're providing. The other thing is time. So, I would say that the average, time that people put in an IEP for a kid with a mild, moderate learning disability is between 30 and 45 minutes. And when I ask people, well, why did you put that? And they'll say, I don't know, we just tend to put that for all kids with disabilities. Now, there is some evidence base, and I'll share that here in a second. But in some cases, shorter time frames of more intensive instruction provide more opportunities for practice. Time itself is not associated with opportunities for learning, right? A kid could sit in a session for 45 minutes and maybe have 2 practice opportunities. But he could also sit in a session for 15 minutes and have 30 practice opportunities that are done at a rapid rate. So in the last session, we talked about, for example, constant time delay, which is like 3 seconds, 3 seconds, 3 seconds, where you could almost have 30 practice opportunities within a very short period of time. So thinking about time is it's not so much the predictor of like, is a student going to do well? It really should be time associated with practice opportunities. Some things take a little bit more time. If I'm teaching a functional skill for cooking, doing that in 10 minutes, heck, I can't even cook in 10 minutes, right? So it might require more time because the kid needs, we got to move slower. But it could also be that we're teaching math facts, and exposure is really critical to understanding math facts. I want to be able to do 30 of those in 3 minutes versus 10 of those in 30 minutes. The other thing that you want to think about in terms of delivery adaptations is the attention to transfer. The primary outcome of SDI and the IEP as a whole is for students to be successful in the general curriculum. So if I'm teaching something in a one-to-one opportunity or in a pull-out session, it really should be for a short period of time so the student has the opportunity to master the skill, but the outcome should be to generalize that skill or to apply it in a sort of novel situation. So this attention to transfer may come into play when we think about delivery adaptations. So in the example we saw before, yeah, you might be learning how to read in your small group SDI, but when you get to general ed, you're still flailing. You don't know how to use it. So that's why in that school B, they said, well, gosh, we're going to also do the multisensory approach within general ed so that the student can see how what they're learning in one setting also applies to another setting. That also may have to do with how the time is allocated across the day. So if I'm teaching, metacognitive and cognitive strategies, and I'm only doing those in the 30 minutes of and special education pullout, I'm hoping they transfer. The likelihood is they will not transfer. So it would be better, instead of doing 30 minutes in special education, to do 10 minutes in 3 content classes so that the kid is learning that strategy and then getting immediate application and reinforcement in a setting in which they would use that. So with that example, I'm going to just talk about 2 scenarios, and I'm going to give you a question here at the bottom. We'll take a little time. So as you're looking at these, think about how students might respond differently to these 2 different delivery adaptations, okay? So in the first one, which is a very common approach, particularly in secondary settings, we have a student who has an IEP. It doesn't talk about any delivery adaptations. It just says the kid gets 150 minutes of explicit instruction in math per week. And so then the district or the school takes that and tries to implement it. School A did mass practice. They ended up doing Monday, Wednesday, Thursday because they were on like a AB schedule, and that's how it worked. And they provided 50 minutes of math practice 3 times a week. Okay, so it still meets the requirements, right? The SDI was around explicit instruction in math, so it's the methodology, the content, and there weren't any delivery adaptations identified. School B chose a distributed practice model. And what they ended up doing is saying, I know math is like a really challenging thing and kids get super fatigued. There's no way the kid's going to sit through 50 minutes of instruction. Heck, I wouldn't do it as an adult. So they ended up saying, well, we're going to break it up and do it every day because we know the kid needs a lot of practice. And we're even going to break up the day. So every day we'll do 30 minutes, and that 30 minutes will be broken up to 10 minutes 3 times a day. So you can see time 1, they kind of generally scheduled it out, but these would be intensive practice opportunities addressing math calculation issues. So take a moment and just think, I know some of you are sitting with some other folks in your group, and how might students respond differently? Both are appropriate based on the IEP, but it's likely we would get different responses in how students are progressing or maybe even engaging in the instruction. And you can just put those in the Q&A. Yeah, so we're getting some feedback. So the second one would probably be more beneficial because it's more consistent and there's more opportunities for success spread across the day. We talk about not as fatigued. They might be more engaged if it's only 10 minutes. Yeah. And math calculation, so if it's distributed, it's actually better. And because sometimes a problem might take more 10 minutes, it may be disruptive. So if for some types of math calculation, maybe the math practice is better, where if it's like math facts or whatnot, it may be better for distributed practice. Yeah, shorter sessions can be more intensive. Um, yeah, and so there was a question like for this scenario, how many students would the teacher have on their caseload? It would seem difficult to manage. And I think, Sky, it's a great question to consider. But what we might see a little bit later is it may not have to be the special ed teacher delivering it. There's no delivery adaptation identified. General ed teacher could do time 2. The special ed teacher might do time 3 with other kids with math calculation challenges. And maybe time 1, it's the homeroom teacher or a peer. Yeah. Yeah, and so some people are saying, well, maybe, with our bell schedule in the secondary, it might actually be really difficult to implement the second distributed practice. And that's true. We function on bell schedules, which is why school A chose the approach that they chose. Distributed practices probably generalizes more to different environments. Yeah, lots of questions about how this happens in the secondary setting. And honestly, it's probably the most effective approach in a secondary setting. And that's because we can't manipulate the bell schedule very much, but it's easier to take 10 minutes of a core class than to take a whole core class away, right? So in the first model, that student may miss math and now is only getting SDI in math. Where in the second model, the student might miss 10 minutes of math, but they're still getting access to the general curriculum. And it's going to look different. Some of you have block schedules and some of you have AB schedules or different, 7-period day schedules. So you'd have to think about that. I'm sorry, I'm reading. Yeah, and it might be so great sort of feedback. Like it might depend on the kid. If I have a kid who's slower for processing, maybe they need more time to be able to do something, I might consider that the first one is a more appropriate model. Yeah. So it's just incorporating more generalization. And so you're getting at this thinking around what is the delivery adaptation? Are we okay if some school A does this and school B does this? Well, the evidence should tell us which one works for this kid. Now, a lot of folks, the evidence is really strong for distributed practices or practice for basic skills, partly because it promotes mastery, generalization, as well as retention of skills. And I think sometimes we think about math as we're reteaching the math curriculum or helping kids with homework. That's not SDI. That's supporting their access to and progress in general ed. SDI, remember, is focusing on a very narrow set of knowledge, skills, or strategies that the student needs as a result of the disability. It also increases student engagement. A lot of you mentioned that, and applicable to the development of various academic and functional skills. Doesn't work for everything, but it may work it does seem to work for most things. So I do have a question, really like the distributed practice model, but curious how this might work. So the question is, would the kid be singled out? And this is where missing on general ed instruction. In most cases, this model, actually the first model, mass practice, leads to greater missing of the entire general curriculum. For kids with disabilities, we are legally obligated to provide that SDI. And so we want to make sure the kid has optimal access and progress in the general curriculum. So what is the least amount of time that we can pull that kid? That's where a team might determine distributed practice is the case. You could also do these before, like in transition periods or places in which the kid is not singled out. But I would definitely, in the high school and secondary setting, work with the kid to determine what is the most appropriate delivery model that works for you, right? Some kids are like, yeah, I need to practice that math because I'm completely failing on my classes. 10 minutes, I can handle that. Where another kid's like, I don't want people knowing I'm in special ed, so I'm gonna move to another external setting to do that. Great question. You will see, and I think this goes back to the questions that we're getting around secondary, the evidence for this is very strong in the early elementary. And the idea is if we address it in early elementary, we prevent it from being a need in the secondary. The evidence does exist, particularly for reading and writing in the secondary settings, like that kids are physically writing multiple times a day versus one mass practice for writing, right? So it's not necessarily applicable to all skills, but it could be applicable to a lot of skills. Something else at the secondary level, social skills, communication skills, those are things that don't make sense to be taught in a 30-minute special education setting, but would be better taught distributed across the day in more naturalistic environments. So think about the kid and the environment and the content when choosing which delivery model you might take. So other things we think about, I kind of mentioned this one at the very beginning, delivery adaptation. We have a kid who has an other health impairment. And if you look at the definition for other health impairment, we see that there are kids who have medical needs. We often think about ADHD or ADD, but there's other like physical medical needs that might fall under this. And fatigue is often associated with some kids with OHI or anxiety. So thinking about the time of day for those services would be really important. And you might, for example, have a kid who has diabetes or something or they're more prone to epileptic seizures in the afternoon. So we would then prioritize delivery in the morning. The other adaptation is that increased practice opportunities. A lot of y'all mentioned that in the in some of the other scenarios. That's really what we're looking for. If I have a caseload of 12 to 20 kids and they all come to me at the same time, I cannot feasibly provide sufficient practice opportunities. So being able to spread those across the day, work with the gen ed teacher and peers to provide some of those practice opportunities really allows the student greater intensity of SDI than I alone as a teacher can provide. And what this might look like documented in the IEP is that, the number of practice opportunities. So depending on the skill, I might say the kid needs to practice this 10 times a day, or, toileting, for example, 2 opportunities per day, so that we're thinking more about the delivery of that SDI for that particular need. The other thing is the number of minutes. Probably what you're most familiar with is we would say he's going to, have this SDI for 30 minutes or 45 minutes, but we do need to be thinking about it in terms of practice opportunities. So there's a question about how does this fit within the co-teaching model? It really depends on how you design co-teaching. If your goal is to ensure that, the co-teaching is the delivery, it's the model that the district is using to implement the IEP, it's not a delivery adaptation, right? So if the kid needs, for example, 15 practice opportunities in a day or in a class period, then in a co-teaching model, that special ed teacher and gen ed teacher will make sure that they plan for 15 practice opportunities. Okay. And then, the documentation and the PLAF, yes, definitely. These are things, imagine this kid's like, you know what, I'm going to move to Utah because, we have less wind, although we have a lot of wind right now. You want to know that that information you included in the IEP is documented enough that if there are specific delivery adaptations, they're in the IEP for the next folks to see that. So I have a question regarding the required need to deliver SDI per IEP goal. That's a great question. I just want to stop there. There's nothing that says it's a direct correlation between a specific SDI and an IEP goal. You could have 4 goals and have SDI, right? So, I mean, we do want to see a direct connection between the proposed SDI to help the student progress on those goals. But it's like if you have 3 reading goals, you're not going to have 3 sets of SDI. You're going to have SDI in reading that includes these content adaptations, these methodology adaptations, and these delivery adaptations, if you've identified those. So that's part of that. Is breaking down the general ed work math with numerous practice opportunities and scaffolding at their level without an evidence base, is that legal? I gotta make sure I understand this regarding the required delivery. There's nothing that says you can't break it down. If your evidence indicates the kid needs that, remember that the program you're delivering is the IEP. If you use like Wilson or whatever, those are programs to help you implement the IEP, but the IEP is the program. And the numerous practice opportunities and scaffolding. Let me go back. I want to make sure I read that question all the way. Sorry, hold on. I moved out real quick. And it may be that I'm not reading it correctly. I mean, providing is this related to the distributed practice opportunities? Maybe you can provide me a little bit more information in the Q&A and I can help answer that one. And how would you put the minutes in the IEP if you're pushing in and out? Again, these are the challenges that we face, and you have your WDE folks on here to help you do that. But honestly, it's about the service that you're providing and thinking about that service. If there's not a particular location for that service to be, then you don't need to do that. And that comes down to, get to this one, is location. Hold on, I have a question actually related to it. I have like where it can be delivered, and it can technically be delivered anywhere, and the location itself is only documented as a delivery adaptation if it needs to be located in a particular place. Otherwise, there's deference to the LEA to implement that. Is a specific evidence-based program required per IEP goal? No. You could use the same evidence-based program to address multiple goals. I think this is a follow-on to the last question. You could use a single, comprehensive program to meet to address multiple goals, right? So let's say I have a metacognitive and cognitive strategy goal, and I have a reading goal. I could develop a single program to address both goals. It's just saying that these are 2 things that the kid's SDI needs to address. So hopefully that helps. Otherwise, you can email me and we can chat it out a little bit in case I'm misreading that. So I know we just have a couple more minutes, but I will say daily is the evidence you'll see in the chat box or in your handout is the primary frequency. Any less frequently, it's probably not intense enough to be specialized. The grouping sizes, this is something to know is most special ed is delivered in small groups. Even OSEP will say that is how the majority of special ed is delivered. And that's because it offers a lot of benefits. It provides access to peers with and without disabilities. It provides modeling opportunities for learning certain skills. It's more efficient from an implementation standpoint. So you have to think about, is it a model the kid or a delivery approach the kid needs, or just what you're going to do for delivery? Some kids, and this should be documented in the IEP, require a one-on-one delivery adaptation. And that may be because of the nature of the disability. They get overwhelmed by people, they're, have phobias or anxiety that requires them to be in a much more intimate setting. It could be the nature of the content. One-on-one is appropriate for toileting. We wouldn't really do small group toileting SDI. And for some kids, they just need that intensity, at a certain period of time in their education, that one-on-one is more appropriate. And the other thing that's come up, but this was a question around who can deliver, and you'll see this, there are some Q&A in the handout that I gave you, but you may determine that a specific type of role or expertise is necessary for the delivery of that SDI. So somehow your data indicates that just if an average person does it, then, this is not going to work. It needs to be delivered by someone trained in ABA or someone trained in, who's a reading specialist. What we would never do is identify an individual in a service for an IEP. And that's because a person is not a service. It's what the person provides as the service. And it's more about what's the skill set or expectation for that person. You'll see here that some kids actually may respond better to peers. So it could be that the nature of the content that you're delivering, maybe you're using peer-mediated instruction that needs to be delivered by a peer, right? So that's where you might document who's going to deliver, but in most cases, it just defaults to the school to choose who's best qualified to do that. So just some common questions, and I'll pick out a couple, and I know we'll close up in like 2 minutes, is just to confirm that SDI can be delivered anywhere. And it's based on the unique needs of the child. If your data confirms that the kid needs to have it in a certain place, then you would document that. But otherwise, it just sort of defaults to the general curriculum or the same sort of opportunities that kids without disabilities have, which might be like in a small group instruction that you already have structured with your WIN that everybody goes to. There has been some guidance from the U.S. Department of Education around can general ed instructions and services provided to all students in both Title I or MTSS interventions be considered SDI? And the short answer is yes. So we saw the example with Wilson for School A, and that's why schools who implement a tiered system of support have better infrastructure for providing specially designed instruction, because you're already addressing unique needs of children without disabilities. It provides the infrastructure to do the same for kids with disabilities. We talked about who can deliver, anyone who's trained to do that. There is in the regulations around related service providers, so please make sure you're familiar with that. It is in the SDI tip sheet, but you may determine that the speech and language pathologist is the most qualified to provide SDI related to communication or language. In most cases, it's a collaboration between the special ed teacher and the related service provider, but that's really dependent upon your state law. We talked about placement decisions. I think this goes back is that placement is a completely different decision within the IEP than delivery adaptations. If you look at the sequence of the IEP, you first determine what the child needs. And if you say, gosh, this kid needs one-on-one, he needs to be free of distractions, then when the IEP team gets to the decision about placement, that data becomes helpful, but they are not the same. And that's where you'll see here at the bottom, if you make adaptations, you use that information to ultimately make decisions about removal from general education or when and how much service the student is going to get for the whole IEP. And I think we talked about co-teaching, but I got a couple questions about it. So I did include that in the handout. So I wanted to make sure you all had it. SDI is not co-teaching. Remember, it is how the district may choose to implement students' SDI, but it is not the SDI. All right, so I'm gonna put this on the evaluation so you guys can see that. And I know some of you have to hop off because you were fives and it's really tiring, but I'll stay on and answer some questions. I do have one in here. It's about, is there a way to write a goal for a student to have tier 1 instruction broken down and have more practice opportunities? It's not really the goal. What you would say is, the goal is I need to improve, math facts or reading proficiency or whatever it might be. But in your services documentation, the delivery adaptation might be that the student needs to have the instruction both delivered within the general education curriculum and a little bit of time outside of it, right? If your data indicate that that's what the student needs. Right now, you can implement the optimal program for the student and use that data to make decisions about the next IEP's PLAF and service delivery. So, yeah, honestly, when IDEA was first enacted, it was not meant as a replacement. It was meant to say all kids start in general ed. Some kids might need some more to fully benefit from general ed. And now we've sort of switched it in some cases where we pull kids out and try to get them back in, right? So I think that's kind of, we have to assume placement in general ed and then only pull out if the unique needs of the child require that. So we did have a question about delivering SDI and can a peer do that? If you're using peer-mediated instruction, technically a trained peer can deliver that instruction if that's what that child needs. I think we're confusing the design and the implementation. The special ed teacher, the licensed teacher designs everything. But if the team determines that, this instruction, is better delivered coming from a peer because of the needs of the child, then that it would still be under the supervision of a special ed teacher, but it might be delivered from that person. Like you just wouldn't let them go off and do their own schooling, I guess. Yeah, and I'm just reading. So how can this might be integrated into instruction for schools that have co-teachers? Yeah, thanks. Well, and thanks, Wes. I mean, I think this is an ongoing discussion, but if you look at the evidence base, sometimes, particularly in secondary, having the instruction come from a peer and peer-assisted learning is an evidence-based strategy. That's a good example of it's more effective than coming from a teacher in some cases. So that's where we're choosing what works for this kid. Yeah, that was a great question, though. So I'm just gonna, hopefully you got the QR code, it's in the chat box. Just something I would recommend moving forward, take a look at your IEPs. It's not like try to change them all, but as you start to write your new IEPs, think about how you can be more explicit in what are the adaptations that the student needs. Do they align with what we documented in the PLAF? And does that PLAF align with the evaluation report? And that'll help you simplify and better communicate with families and other educators responsible for implementing. So there's a question around, I know if you have to hop off. Are intervention teachers, like tier 2 teachers, considered specialists that can deliver needs, minutes, SDI, and an IEP? They can. They really should, make sure they're prepared. But if they're the most trained to deliver, let's say Wilson, and you've determined Wilson is the how you're going to implement that IEP, then they could technically deliver that. What I want to caution, though, is not say, oh, heck, we don't have a job. It's gen ed can do everything. They can't do both. So if we're asking them to do one thing, somebody else has to take responsibility for the other thing they should have been doing. So think about that. But if you look at IDEA, really it's about providing optimal access to kids with and without disabilities. Those types of settings really help kids, not stick out like as a high school student because there are other kids who are there and everybody's benefiting from that. All right, I know I went over on time. I know I get super excited about it. But I think, as I mentioned last time, let's make sure that, we're continuing these conversations. Have them at your schools. Really talk about, are we addressing the needs of the child and documenting those and being creative in the way that we implement so that the student can really access the curriculum as well as benefit or progress towards their IEP goals. Thanks, y'all. Yep, there's a certificate of attendance. The recordings will be there. Please contact the WDE if you have any questions. Take care, guys.
Tessie, I just want to say thank you. And thank you to Jennifer and to Susan for helping with this while I was traveling and trying to get online. So, but what a wonderful session. Many thanks are in the Q&A here for you, and we second that as well. Just a plethora of information. I agree. Many said they want to go back and rewatch so that they can even capture what's in all of these trainings. So Tessie, thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. And we definitely look forward to seeing you this summer. We will be holding an in-person conference this year for teachers. It will be focused around SDI and go even a little more in-depth than these trainings. Also, like Tessie said, we have the book study coming up on February 11th. Registration is closed to receive a free book, but if you're interested in purchasing the book and joining us, please feel free to email me and I'd be happy to add you to the list if you didn't get on there. This will hopefully just help to solidify a lot of this wonderful training that you've had with Dr. Bailey, and just help to deepen your understanding about SDI as we go throughout this year, just with a more intense focus on SDI. So thank you for your attendance and your participation. You guys have been a wonderful audience throughout this whole series. So thank you very much for joining us. And Dr. Bailey, safe travels where you're going to next.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to Idaho tomorrow in a blizzard, so it's going to be fun. Thanks, y'all.
Safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessie.
Thanks, Susan.
For those of you who might still be on, if you missed, so we have been putting the attendance at the end of each session. If you missed a session for those attendants, please email me separate, because this form will be for this training today.
And Wes, I don't know if you're on, but I'd love to chat more, because I think there's always this imbalance between delivery adaptations and service delivery models, and trying to tease out those the differences between those. I think sometimes they get confused. So yeah, I can see where people struggle with that. Thanks, Don. I think you see the question about the dates for the book study. Somebody's just asking about that.
I did not see that yet. Yeah, I will. Yes, Shiloh, if you had registered, there will be an email coming out shortly that has the outline with all of the information and the Zoom links in there. If you did not get those, I will, if you'll email me, I can send you the whole email that has all of that information. But we are starting on February 11th, will be the first session.
And there's a question is, will there be sessions for other elements of the IEP?
In the future, yes. Right now, I don't have anything scheduled, but you will be getting some different parts at that in-person training.
And I would say if you're still on, check out the promotingprogress.org. It is an OSEP funded center that has a module and a tip sheet for all 7 components of the IEP. I will also say that the Department of Ed in its LMS system has some great modules as well on most of the components. They're all coming, but they're not all up yet.
We do have those, and we also have, when you get this follow-up email, when you go to that Wyoming Instructional Network, there are prior trainings that we have recorded and materials for that you're welcome to go into. Those will be housed there, and you're welcome to go and use those as trainings or just for your own personal professional development. I'm trying to read these two just to make sure we have them all.
I'm not sure what the link is, but I'm putting the promoting